All right, boys and girls, I'm going to read all the grays on Greene Street today. And we're going to start on page 31. And if you think back to where we read before, Olympia Ollie got into bed with her mom, and she thought about kind of staying there. And then she went outside on their fire escape and saw somebody putting posters up, and the person that was putting the poster up looked up at her and kind of nodded his head to her, and it made her think that maybe that was a message that was meant for her. And the message, if you remember, it had bright yellow letters and it said wake up, and she thought that it was maybe meant for her mother and her. So we're going to continue on page 31. This is chapter's called Sir. It's 22 steps up the studio from our fire escape. I don't have a fear of heights or anything, but I do it without looking down. Once I had my face pressed up to the huge studio windows, I could see Apollo standing in front of one of the easels, cleaning a painting of triangles with a cotton ball. The big floor fans weren't on, so I guessed he was just using water. My dad says you can do most of what you need to do in life with intelligence and water. Even though the window was closed, I could hear Apollo's music, which is always jazz and very loud. If my dad needs a little quiet, Apollo listens through earphones connected to the bright yellow Walkman he clips to his belt. Every once in a while, he'll stop what he's doing to lead the band or to shimmy. So a Walkman is what we had to use in the 80s, and it was a little thing about this big, and you actually had to put a tape in it. So it's a cassette tape. So if you need to look that up, go ahead and look it up. It's old. Parents might have some still sitting around the house, something like that. But a lot of times you'll see it on like clip art and stuff for like the 90s and 80s. Okay. My dad and Apollo usually work back to back, but there was nothing on the easel where my dad usually works. There hadn't been since he'd left. Something else was missing too, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Nothing had felt quite right since my dad had gone, except for Apollo, who is my favorite and always the same. The thing about Apollo is that he's the ugliest person I've ever seen. I'm not saying that to be mean, it's just a true fact. When I was really little, I did say it right to his face, and he laughed. Mostly, he looks like a lion. He's enormous, first of all. And when he was a teenager, he had the kind of acne that hurts and leaves scars, so his face looks like it's melted. But he had incredibly kind eyes, and once you get over being scared to look at him, you can't stop. His face never gets boring like regular people's faces do. So what he's talking about there is whenever he was a teenager, he had really bad pimples and zits and stuff in his skin, and it scarred his skin, and it made his skin really rough. So that's what they're talking about there. That's not very smooth and soft. Apollo seems younger than my parents, even though he's the same age. Mostly that's because of his clothes. He was wearing a pair of olive green army pants, a yellow button-down shirt over a red t-shirt, and shiny black patent leather belts, and an aquamarine bandana as a scarf. Aquamarine's like a teal blue. For him, this was fairly toned down. He says he loves color because they didn't have any in Poland where he was when he was growing up, which is a kind of joke he makes. But my dad says Apollo knows more about color than anyone he's ever met. I didn't want Apollo to think I was a creeper, so I tapped on the window. He turned around and smiled wide when he saw me, then rolled the gigantic window up to let me in. He held my hand to help me down from the windowsill like I was a fancy lady getting out of a carriage. That's a really good image. On one foot, he was wearing a purple sneaker. On the other was white. Sometimes he does that just to throw you off. You provide a delightful interpretation, Olympia. I'm ready to stop. Sorry, a delightful interruption, Olympia. I am about ready to stop. It is very stupid garbage, this painting, but money is money, am I right, little bird? I nodded. Money was something I'd been thinking about a lot since my dad went off to France. It's hard not to worry when you don't know how much money there is and how much everybody needs. Apollo saw a look on my face. Sit for 15 minutes and let me finish, and then we will have supper together. If you are up for it, perhaps we could take a walk over to the spicy one. I nodded gratefully. The spicy one is our favorite restaurant. But we usually go on the weekends because it's all the way over on East Broadway. On school nights, we go to Po Ping because they have the best pressed duck and the line is shorter there than at Bobo's on Mott. But the long walk over to the spicy one would be a good time to ask Apollo if he knew how to get in touch with my dad. The sign outside the spicy one says, Huan Yan Noodle Shop, even though the best thing there is the roasted pork, which they make with, I don't know this word, Szechun. Sushan? I'll have to look that. What up? Peppercorns. So I'm assuming it's some type of pepper. Eating one Susan peppercorn makes your mouth go numb. Richard says they make your tongue feel like it's a zombie. My dad and Richard share an interest in movies about monsters, so my dad calls the spicy one Zombie Chinese. While he was finishing up, I asked Paulo what color he thought his t-shirt was. Vermilion, he said immediately. Then he looked down and changed his mind. Cinnabar. They are basically the same thing, except that cinnabar is the unground material and vermilion is the color. It's unground mineral and vermilion is the color. But there's a difference between the why it looks ground and unground. Apollo can see it. I love the studio. The walls are white and tall, like in an apartment downstairs. But in our apartment, the two couches and the trunk we use for a coffee table seem lost in the space. The studio, on the other hand, is filled with wonderful mess. Everything a person could possibly need to build or fix or make some art. The planks of the wood floor are spotted with paint and pieces of masking tape, and there are fingerprints, paint, and solvent on every surface. But everything has a place. Brushes are kept under the long, low tables by the windows in big tin cans. Rags are under there, too. Taking them to the beautiful Vick's Laundry. There's some strange words in here. I don't know how to say, boys and girls. Taking them to the beautiful Vick's Laundry and folding them when they come out of the dryer is one of my favorite jobs. In the middle of the studio, there are 4 tables like my mom's workbench downstairs, big enough that you can really spread out. Between them, paint-splattered wooden carts on wheels hold spools of cotton batty, putty, and film for patching, long-handled Q-tips for work detail, and little trowels for mixing paint. Shelves between the windows hold chemicals in white plastic containers as well as different types of paints. There's a pegboard covered with tools, screwdrivers, saws, pliers, hammers, planes. Opposite, 3 long shelves sag with hundreds of hardcover art books, most of them found on the street or bought used. It's hard to have a conversation with my dad or Apollo without one of them running over to the bookshelf to show you a picture. But my dad wasn't there, and I wasn't in the mood to look at a book, so I cleaned the brushes in the sink while I waited. The brushes that art restorers use are very expensive and need to be handled carefully, but I've known what to do since I was little. You have to get every smudge of paint, which means rinsing long after the water has run clear, keeping all the hairs going the same way. When he was done with the triangle painting, Apollo took out his own notebook to find the telephone number of the girlfriend he was supposed to have dinner with. Apollo always has 72 different girlfriends going at once, and they're almost always crying or mad at him. This one was no different. She had a lot to say when she heard he made other plans, but Apollo held the phone away from his ear and winked at me. It's beyond my control. This thing that has come up is very important. It must be attended to. I'm very sorry, but it cannot be helped. They went on like that for a while. I didn't listen to all of it, but wandered off to the corner of the loft where Apollo keeps his colors. I love everything about this studio, but I love this corner the best. Narrow wooden shelves are stacked with jars, their labels soaked off, another one of my jobs. Some of the jars have powder inside, or oils, or chunks of wood. Some have nothing in them but one tiny rock. Every one of them has a paper tag tied to a piece of string around the neck of the jar and labeled in Apollo's bristly European handwriting. The jars hold our pigments. For hundreds of years, artists made and mixed their paints themselves instead of buying them from a store, and Apollo still does it that way. It's useful to know how to mix colors from pigment when you restore canvases that are very old, but Apollo mixes colors for his own paintings too, which is why they're so beautiful they make your chest hurt. Most of our pigments don't look like the colors they make. In fact, most of them don't look like anything at all, but the names on the labels are clues that there's magic inside. Orpiment, azurite, rose madder, ochre, ancora, cinnabar, malachite, anatomy. Wow, never heard most of those words. Our grinding table is a giant slab of bottle green glass that Apollo found in the street and set up on sawhorses. I ran my finger over the wavy glass with the uneven spray of bubbles inside. There was a fine layer of dust on it. With my dad gone, I guess Apollo hadn't had much time to make colors. The easel in the corner held a yellow study where he'd been working on before my dad left. The best yellow comes from Cambodia. To get it, you tap a tree like you're making maple syrup. It takes a whole year to get a bucket. Dried gamboge doesn't look like much, just another sticky, ugly brown rock. But put a drop of water on it, and that rock will weep a tear so brightly yellow it will hurt your eyes. It's interesting to hear how he's making his own paints and stuff. I'll have to ask Mrs. Clance about that. I bet Mrs. Clance would like this book too. I'll have to send her the links to it. And she'll probably tell me all the ways I'm saying the words wrong. That's okay though. I'm still learning just like you are. Last year, Apollo made me his apprentice and gave me the first color study we made together. A wash of blues, some so light they looked white, others almost black in their intensity. The blues in between were so deep and rich that looking at them made you feel like you were learning something. It hangs opposite my bed and is my most prized possession. Please accept my most sincere apologies. I will make it up to you, beautiful, I promise. On the other side of the loft, Apollo's call seemed finally to be winding down. With a sigh of relief, he replaced the heavy black receiver on the wall, and I grabbed my sweatshirt and my notebook, my stomach growling in anticipation of dinner. But as we were heading towards the door, the phone rang again. Apollo backed away like the phone was a bomb about to explode, eyes wide with mock terror. Annoyed, I rolled my eyes at him and took the heavy black receiver from the cradle on the wall. Greene Restoration, I said. Whenever I answer the phone in the studio, I pretend to be a secretary in an old-fashioned movie. On the side Apollo couldn't see, I snuck up a hand to remove an invisible clip-on earring. So that's what they would do in old movies and stuff. That's kind of fun. It wasn't the girlfriend again, but some guy with an accent who sounded like Alex when he wasn't pretending to have an accent. The guy on the phone pronounced Apollo's last name correctly, which is practically a magic trick. Hold, please, I said, sounding bored and professional like a real secretary, and held the phone out to Apollo. When he took it from me, I rolled my finger at him, keep it moving, so he wouldn't get stuck for 12 hours on one of his hot topics, like the pros and cons of painting on canvas with automotive enamel. In case you care, the colors and finishes are beautiful, but the paints can make you sick, and they sometimes yellow as they age. Except, this wasn't another artist on the phone. As I have said many times now, I am not in possession of this piece of art, Apollo said, turning his big, bare body away from where I'd planted myself in front of him. I'd be happy to help. Unfortunately, my partner is not here. He's out of the country at this time. The man on the other end interrupted. I could hear his agitation. The skin in the back of my neck prickled. Apollo was talking about my dad. What piece of art? Apollo sighed. I am very sorry. As I told you the other day, I am not in touch with him. That had the alarming ring of truth, and my stomach sank. I'd been counting on Apollo to help me get in touch, dead sure that the trickiest part of getting the information would be hiding what was going on with my mom. But if Apollo was telling the truth, if he really didn't know how to get in touch with my dad, then nobody would. Which meant I was back to square one. Worse even because I didn't have another plan. Yes, I have your number. If I hear anything at all about the piece, I will not hesitate to call you. Thank you, sir. Good night. With that, Apollo replaced the black heavy receiver onto the cradle on the wall. Hearing him call someone sir felt like the worst thing that had happened yet. I was right in front of him when he turned around. What was that about? I asked. He shook his head, not looking at me, his big body moving uncomfortably from side to side. Forget about it, please. It was nothing, little bird. At least he looked miserable lying to me. I cut into the chase. You don't know how to get in touch with him? Was that true? Was that part true? We both knew which him I was talking about. We have not spoken since he left, he said, setting his jaw and looking toward the windows. In that moment, I realized that Paulo might be one of the people who didn't agree with what my dad was doing, and I didn't like that at all. I tried to think of something mean or smart to say, but I ended up saying what I was thinking, which was, why won't anybody tell me what's going on? We looked at each other for a long time, and then Apollo made a face and shook his head. I can't. I bit my lip hard as the weight of the day crashed down around me. I thought about the dumb fight I'd picked with Alex on the way to school and Richard's panicked eyes when I told him about my mom. I thought about my blotchy, botched self-portrait in charcoal and about my mom's blank eyes. When I could trust my voice, I raised my chin. How do I know he's okay? Apollo came forward to reassure me, but there wasn't anything he could say. I turned away from the comfort of his familiar face. Even if my dad was okay, my mom wasn't. And if my dad didn't come home, I wasn't going to be okay either. All right, let's read a few more chapters. Sorry, a few more pages. The next chapter is called 5 for $1. Upset as I was, my stomach growled again as I followed Apollo out of the studio. I waited as he bent down to pick up a ball of newspaper and some other scraps of trash that had blown into the little tiled vestibule at the bottom of the stairs. He passed them to me to hold while he pressed down the ratty silver duct tapes securing the artist in residence sign at the front of the building. The AIR sign is there to let firemen know that our building isn't abandoned or a factory, empty at night. Some of the AIR signs you see around Soho are official looking, white letters embossed onto plastic plaques like the nameplate outside the principal's office at my school. But the sign on our door is a piece of cardboard box wrapped in plastic and duct taped to the window. AIR2, written in thick black marker on the front. The 2 is because we live in the second floor. So they put that there so if a fireman comes at night, they know it's unabandoned and then that there is actually someone there. And it's not empty, so they put that on the door so they know that someone does live there, is unabandoned, and if there's a problem, they know to go to the second floor because people live there. So I think that's pretty cool. Okay, maintenance complete, the two of us walked down Greene Street toward Canal. Even though it was almost dark, there were very few lights on in the buildings as we passed. The lofts near us that don't have factories or artists in them are mostly used for storage. Bundles of old rags and paper, and not very many people around to call 911 when they smell smoke. There's a reason that firefighters call my neighborhood Hell's 100 Acres. He turned left at the corner of Canal, and the subliminal mind control I used on Apollo must have worked, because he looked across the street at the art supply store, but he didn't cross to go in. I love pearl paint too, but I was way too worn out and hungry for an hour of small talk about solvents. We did stop to look at the boxes outside the hardware stores on Canal. Apollo was standing over a tray filled with skinny spatulas when a cardboard box filled with tiny brass objects caught my eye. There were little faucets like the red ones you use to turn off the water supply under a sink, except brass and miniature, only a little bigger than my thumbnail. Too big for a dollhouse, too small to be used under a sink for real. I bet my mom would like these, I said, breaking the silence and dropping one of the brass faucets into Apollo's palm. 5 for $1. He looked at it closely and then nodded and pulled 2 bills out of his wallet. The woman who had come out of the store handed me a small brown bag, and I counted 10 of the tiny faucets into it. My mom and my dad and Apollo and Alex's mom all met at art school in Brooklyn. Even though my mom and Apollo are the only ones still making art, my dad can draw anything. He's the one who taught me, but now he only works on other people's art. My mom, on the other hand, can't help but make things. Over breakfast at a coffee shop, she'll knot napkins and wrappers from our straws, using a drop of water or coffee or juice to mold paper. By the time we've finished our bacon and eggs, she'll have turned the whole table into a sculpture garden. One time she didn't like a book I brought home from school about the first Thanksgiving, so she cut it up to make a collage about the pilgrims stealing land from the Wampanoag and the diseases they brought that practically wipe out the tribe. Oh my gosh, please don't do that to your library books. Another time, my dad asked her to sew a button back onto his favorite shirt, and she stitched geometric patterns like wild vines up the sleeves instead. The next time he wore it, the lady on the street offered to buy it off of him for $100. Apollo and I turned off Canal Street onto Mott. Little kids chased one another up and down the narrow block while moms squeezed melons and grandpas smoked behind the parked cars. We stopped at a fruit and vegetable stand where Apollo bought a bag of the tiniest mangoes I'd ever seen, the size of walnuts. The green beans right next to them were as long as my forearm. Honestly, the size of them is the only special thing about them. We get them at Wolping with garlic and ground pork, and they taste exactly like the short kinds. My dad says observation is a muscle that artists have to build. You have to choose the details you include in a drawing, and to choose them, you have to see them. Don't draw a cartoon out of what you think strawberries look like, he always told me. Look at the strawberry, then draw what you see, not what you think you see. So I practiced my observing. Most of the stores on Mott had big metal garage doors that rolled up in front instead of windows, making it hard to tell where the sidewalk ended and the stores began. At one place, whole fish stared back at me from beds of melting ice, sparkling purple, brown, and blue and silver underneath metal hanging scales. Pink shrimp, cooked and cleaned, lay next to gray ones with their heads still on. In the back of another store, I saw an aquarium crowded with silvery brown carp, and another one, the water dark with eels. That's really cool. I can imagine all of that there. Walking up and down the street and seeing all the shops and stuff with the food out, fresh food and fruit and vegetables, and then all the fresh fish. That sounds really cool. I can see those little beady eyes of the fish staring back at me. I've seen it on TV before, and I've never seen it in real life. That'd be really cool to see in New York. I'm sure it's in other places too. I looked into a woven wooden basket, almost as tall as I was, sitting by the curb. Inside were hundreds of live crabs. The slow chitter of their claws moving around the hard bodies of the others made me shiver. They had greenish, grayish, brown bodies and beautiful blue claws. Lapis, I said out loud, and Apollo smiled. Lapis lazuli is the stone you grind to get ultramarine, the most beautiful and the most expensive of the blue pigments. It used to cost so much that Michelangelo had to leave a corner of one of his most famous paintings unfinished because he couldn't afford the paint. Lapis is expensive now because it comes from Afghanistan, which is in a war with Russia. It's hard to get. Apollo has some though, and before you grind it into ultramarine, lapis has streaks of gray and brown and white in it, the same colors as the crabs. Apollo said, "They tell me that in old San Juan, the streets are cobbled with bricks cast from the waste that comes from making iron, brought to Puerto Rico 300 years ago as ballast as the bottom of Spanish ships. The stones they use to make New York's cobblestones come as ballast on ships from Belgium." My dad told me that. I don't know what that word ballast is. B-A-L-L-A-S-T. I'm probably saying it incorrectly, but I'm going to look it up when we're done reading. The iron made these bricks blue, all different shades. Imagine ordinary streets paved in cobalt, azure, and indigo. Apollo smiled down at me. Perhaps you and I will go to old San Juan one day and dance on bricks the color of blue crabs' claws. I looked at the crabs crawling on top of one another, going nowhere, and I wished I could tell Apollo about my mom. But the emptiness on her face when she said she couldn't go back scared me into silence. Maybe, if things didn't get better and my dad wasn't back yet, I could tell Apollo. Maybe he'd let me stay with him for a while. The two of us stood there for a minute more, watching the crabs. I didn't know they had cobblestones anywhere but here, I said finally. Apollo nodded. Paris is famous for them, actually. Paris, in France, where my dad was. We were quiet the rest of the way to Huan Yan, which is the spicy noodle, or spicy one. That ends this chapter on page 45. I'll continue reading in a new recording, but why do you think that Apollo is taking her to dinner and she doesn't want to tell Apollo about her mom? Do you think perhaps that her mom, we've suspected that maybe she's done this before, and so maybe Apollo knows about it, and You know, why is he taking her to this restaurant that they don't ever go to on a weeknight and they only save it for the weekends? Why might he be taking her there now? It makes me curious. Does Apollo know something that she doesn't realize? I don't know. So I hope you're enjoying this. And if you want to keep watching and listening, then I will keep posting. So hope you're all doing well and hope you're all safe. And boys and girls, if you want to chat with somebody, you can send me a Google Hangout or a message if you just want to type. You can just type in my name and it should come up. It's BLYTHE. So if you want to do that, you're welcome to do that. I've already chatted with a few students about some of the books they're reading, and I have to say I miss your faces so much, and I would love to talk to you. Even if you don't want to talk about books, if you want to talk about just what's going on in your house, we can talk about that too. So I miss you guys all so much. Bye-bye.